which Vanessa Lea Freund will defend her academic thesis, Still Waters Run Deep Below Narcissism's Surface. May I invite you to present a summary of your research and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you. Dear Pro-Rector, dear members of the Defense Committee, dear supervisors, family and friends, for the next 50 minutes I would like to present the findings from my PhD research about narcissism. So for most of us, when we think of narcissism, we probably have to think of someone specific. Maybe a boss who is power hungry, maybe a politician who is too self-convinced, a boss who is power hungry, or a co-worker who thinks too highly of themselves. Popular belief is that when someone is described as narcissistic, they're arrogant, they love themselves, they're egoistic, and they always behave like that. Well, that is what the outside perceives. To understand narcissism, we need to understand that there's a difference between what is going on the inside and what is portrayed to the outside world. The main theory of narcissism suggests that narcissistic tendencies emerge as a normal part of development, but that these characteristics can become stronger or even pathological when the sense of self isn't properly developed. It is believed that narcissism consists of a fragile core, where feelings of inferiority are internalized, and a hard exterior is built to shield this fragile core from the outside with these socially unpleasant characteristics that we think of when we think of a narcissist. The typical picture that we have in our head of a narcissist is what is called grandiose narcissism. The grandiose expression is often associated with entitlement, superiority, manipulative behaviors, and interpersonal dominance. Additionally, there's an observable sense of egotism and self-importance. And for a long time, this has been the only type of narcissism that was investigated. But clinicians have observed that there are also other people who also present with this sense of self-importance, who are also self-enhancing, but without this great sense of grandiosity. Instead, they rather show feelings of inadequacy and low self-esteem. They're more socially passive and withdrawn, and they're hypersensitive to criticism. This is what is now called vulnerable narcissism. Given the differences in presentations and misconceptions about narcissism, the first part of the thesis focused on what defines the grandiose and what defines the vulnerable. So for this, we looked at self-beliefs. Self-beliefs are guiding principles that we have about ourselves. They're characteristics of how we think we are or how we would like to be. And we looked into the content of these beliefs and whether they were positive or negative. What we found was that the grandiose traits largely related to believing that one is personally successful, so that is in line with a common perception of narcissism. But we also found some grandiose individuals that related to believing that people should be community-driven, and that they were also aware that they possess socially undesirable traits. So for the other type, the vulnerable type, related to negative self-beliefs. So these were either about the self or social characteristics. So this shows that there are parts of narcissistic traits that are not in line with the common perception of the self-confident narcissist, and that they can ultimately also have a negative view on the self. Okay, so what can we take away from this? Well, first, there's more below the surface. And second, the individuality behind the broad dimensions matter. And a one-fits-all approach leads to an overly simplified perception and misconception of narcissism. Likewise, another misconception about narcissism is that narcissists love themselves. But is that actually true? Well, in reality, it's actually related to increased self-harm, reduced life satisfaction, and higher rates of anxiety and depression, just to name a few. The other side of the coin is that narcissists do not care about others. Well, is that true? Well, yes. Narcissism is linked to relationship issues such as derogatory behavior or aggression. Okay, so narcissists suffer personally and do not treat others well. But what can we do about this? It has been suggested that pro-social interventions could help. So we wanted to see if compassion can help. Compassion entails recognizing hardship and meeting it with kindness, calm humanity, and mindfulness. So something narcissists seem to lack. This can either be directed towards the self or others. And this self and other compassion has been shown to have beneficial effects on mental health, such as lower anxiety or aggression rates, which seem to be a good starting point for narcissism. We first checked whether this self and other compassion can generally be increased, and after we found that it can be, we then added grandiose and vulnerable traits into the mix. We found that self and other compassion could still be increased, and that largely irrespective of the narcissistic traits. So overall, the increases in self and other compassion speak for the perceptiveness of narcissistic individuals and their potential need for compassion. Given the fact that narcissists are supposed to have a fragile core and would thus benefit from self-compassion, it seems that it may be possible to counteract this fragility when self-compassion is directly targeted. And given the success of increasing other compassion, it seems that a lack of compassion for others and general antisocial tendencies as associated with narcissism may be counteracted when training other compassion. Consequently, we can say that while narcissism is associated with personal and interpersonal issues, this is not static. And there's a potential for pro-social attitudes within narcissism, which is contrary to common belief. So now that we know that compassion in narcissists is not stable, the question is narcissism even stable? Which brings us to the second part of the thesis. Personality characteristics are thought to be persistent. They are what defines us. While we don't want to dispute the stable parts, there's more. So the whole trait theory suggests that traits, so the stable personality characteristics such as the narcissistic traits we've been talking about so far, are accompanied by states, which are momentary thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. So the traits guide how emotions develop in the moment, and our everyday life and situations within it can trigger the emotional states. So let me illustrate this. We have a daily life, and within our daily life, we experience varied emotions. For example, we have a situation. Here, we're lying in a hammock in our garden, and a cat is napping on us. So in this moment, you could feel happy. Then we have another situation where we are working. In this moment, you could feel unhappy as you don't get to lie in your garden. But a different person with a different set of traits might also feel worried because there's still so much work to do. Or another person might even feel happy because they get to sip their coffee and they feel productive. So these personal differences on whether we would feel happy or not surely somewhat depend on the situation. But even more, it's an interpretation of the situation. And this interpretation depends on our own characteristics. But how does this apply to narcissism? That is what we wanted to find out. So to investigate this, participants got notifications on their smartphones 10 times a day for 6 days, which asked them how they felt, among other things. But I'm going to focus on the narcissistic state emotions here. So if narcissism is stable, then the trait characteristics should be mirrored by state emotions. For example, grandiose traits should be mirrored by feelings of power or brilliancy, and vulnerable traits by feelings of resentment or underappreciation. And largely, that is what we found. The more narcissistic traits an individual had, the more narcissistic emotions they experienced in daily life. So far, so good. But now to the question if these narcissistic emotions are stable. So for this, we looked at the state emotions and how they developed over time. And we found that they weren't stable, but they fluctuated. meaning that at one or more times in a day they were higher or lower than at another time. Moreover, we found that changes in emotions can vary a lot from moment to moment. So all in all, we could conclude that stable narcissistic characteristics are accompanied by varying moving states, which means that narcissistic individuals feel and behave more or less narcissistic at times. So now that we know that there is movement, we also wanted to know if it's only about more or less narcissistic moments, or if there are also times where they're not momentarily narcissistic. So we wanted to know if these fluctuations occurred above the line, like this, where one is always in a narcissistic state, or whether one switches in and out of the states, crossing the threshold line between being in a vulnerable state and not being in one, like this. What we found was that narcissistic states are experienced in a way that one switches in and out of them. Additionally, the findings showed that more time spent in a narcissistic state when narcissistic traits were higher, and that individuals with narcissistic traits are not experiencing narcissistic emotions consistently. So it looked a little more like this. This means that there are times at which a narcissistic individual does not behave narcissistic, and it necessitates researchers and clinicians to acknowledge and explore alternating real-life experiences of grandiose and vulnerable narcissistic traits and states. So on top of that, we found that these fluctuations and switches not only exist for the grandiose and the vulnerable types specifically, but that there's crossover between them. This means that some grandiose individuals also experience fluctuating vulnerable narcissistic states and vice versa, which is contrary to the common classification where one is either grandiose or vulnerable. And that made us wonder, are individuals always either grandiose or vulnerable? Do they have to be mutually exclusive, or is it possible to be both? So we decided to explore the question mark, and we added the combined type. So we took 6 of our participants and described and visualized their narcissistic state experiences individually. Based on their narcissistic traits, 2 of them were categorized as predominantly grandiose, 2 as predominantly vulnerable, and 2 as the newly added combined type. We found that these presented cases indicate that there are broad patterns of how the grandiose, vulnerable, and combined types each experience their narcissistic states. We found that all of the types at least experienced some grandiosity and vulnerability in daily life. And interestingly, the combined cases showed the largest presence and variability of vulnerability. So the findings differ to some extent from our previous results, as the combined cases would have been grouped with either the grandiose or the vulnerable trait findings, and those would have been muddled up in the group results. So this suggests that a fine-grained approach with nuanced presentations is key to disentangling the narcissistic picture. We also did not only look at the couple of participants per group, but we looked at them individually. And we found various individual differences. For example, one participant would only experience grandiosity or vulnerability in daily life, so they were mutually exclusive, while others experienced them simultaneously. And this would have been overlooked in group-based results. So all in all, these varied presentations would be neglected without individualized assessment. So customized care and research can aid treatment approaches and further our understanding of individual narcissistic experiences. Overall, we wanted to highlight the need to supplement group-based findings with personalized approaches to explore a person's true colors. So to conclude, the thesis showed differences in narcissistic presentations and debunked some stereotypes. It showed that narcissistic traits are accompanied by narcissistic states, that there is crossover between the grandiose and the vulnerable dimension, and that individuality and real-life experiences are necessary to include to establish a grand picture of narcissism. As for future directions, The study should be replicated with different samples and assessment methods. Individuality should be highlighted, and situational factors that trigger the state should be explored. And lastly, greater attention should be paid to the state perspective and daily life presentations. So with that, I would like to thank my supervisors, the turtles, and everyone here today. I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Peter Muris, Professor in Developmental Psychopathology at Maastricht University's Faculty of Psychology and Neuroscience, and Professor Muris is also the chair of the assessment committee.
Thank you, Madam Prorector. Dear candidates, first I have to compliment you and your promotion team with the nice thesis. I know it has been a journey which is not very common to normal PhD trajectories. So, and that is also an extra compliment for you that you achieved this within, well, let's put it this way, a limited amount of time. You did a great amount of research and work. So my compliments for this, first of all. The opening question that I have for you is an easy one, because, well, it's good to start with an easy question. And this concerns the title of your thesis, Still Waters Run Deep. And I looked at this saying, and at Google I found it means it's a quiet and calm manner may conceal a passionate nature. Okay, so then I thought back of my former boss, who was professor, and he was what I would call, I looked also at the DSM criteria, a narcissistic personality disorder. And I give you just an example to give you an impression of how the guy behaved. Mm-hmm. So at that time, I was just an assistant professor, and he was the boss of the whole faculty, and we had a building with a large parking lot, but just besides the building there was a small strip where there was pavement, basically a pavement, and there was a small space for one car. And each morning he came in and he put the car on that pavement, and well, only 5 meters to the door, and it was accepted because he was important. But that one day, a student who had a tutor group in the morning, 8:30, was ahead of him and put his deux chevaux, a French car, a small French car, on that spot. And so we had a lunch break. The tutor group was apparently over, but because in the lunch break we were all sitting together, and the boss was also in the main position at the table, and we were all lunching, and then the student entered, and he was really quiet and calm and nervous, and he came and he said, well, may I ask a question? There is a car, I cannot leave. There is a car parked in front of my car, I cannot leave. And then the chair, the professor, he stood up and he verbally abused the student in a very offensive manner, shouting at him and saying that he should wait till 8:30 in the evening, and then he would leave, and then his car would be free to go. Okay? So this is just an example. And then I was thinking about the still waters run deep. So why did you, if you have a picture of narcissism like this, why did you? How does this correspond with the title of your thesis? That's my first question.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, well, first of all, thank you for the compliments and the question. That sounds quite unpleasant, but So there was a running theme with the titles. So we had ripples in the water to say that this mirror-like reflection that, you know, in the tale of Narcissus exists, that is sometimes disturbed. And the still waters run deep was kind of to say like that mirror-like reflection in Narcissus' tale. But then that there's more below the surface. So you have all these, grand, usually like with a grandiose type, these big personality factors that everyone notices. But theoretically, at the core, there's a fragility. And so there's much, much more than what is just portrayed to the outside.
Okay. So, the apparent calmness of this professor, it is there sometimes, maybe. It may be in a state, but then down there is a lot of turmoil. Do I understand this?
Yeah, and I mean that, but also that there's just the fragility isn't shown to the outside usually, right? So there's what we usually perceive, and then much, much further down, that isn't what isn't portrayed to the outside. There's a much bigger story. So that, you know, a story that runs deep.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. My second question has to do with the difference that you make between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. Well, you not only make this is done in the research in general, but I heard that you are also a clinician, or becoming one. So I was interested in your opinion, apart from the whole thesis. So what to think about this vulnerable narcissism? I'm not sure, because as a clinician, I think, okay, we have things like comorbidity, for example. And when I look at the core of narcissism, this has always to do with, well, in the DSM, I looked at narcissism personality disorder, and it says like it is a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy. These are the three core elements. And then I look at this vulnerable narcissism, I think, okay, it is assumed that it is below the surface, maybe. But on the other hand, what would you think if you saw a bulimic patient without vomiting? Or a PTSD, a post-traumatic stress disorder, without a trauma? Or an obsessive-compulsive disorder without compulsions? So what to think of this? Because the key element is, well, is it there? Or is it just vulnerable? Also, when I look at your data, I see, for example, when I relate to self-compassion, you see they are, and I also look at the literature, when you look at the divergent validity, the discriminant validity of vulnerable and grandiose narcissism is quite convincing, I think. Because when you relate to different concepts, all kind of different concepts, grandiose is, for example, positively correlated to aggression and all the stuff, whereas vulnerable narcissism is well, not related or even negatively related to such concepts. So my question is, do you believe in the concept of vulnerable narcissism? Is it really a form of narcissism, or is it more like a comorbid concept, or what do you think of it?
Well, first of all, I think I believe in the concept. I understand that it's sometimes hard to grasp, and I also don't think all the research in the area is done and we have a perfect picture of it yet. But vulnerable narcissism, it still has most of the factors that you associate with a narcissist. It's just much more internal than external. So there's still the egocentricity, the antagonism, the entitlement, but they're not shouting it out to the world. So a lot of times it's also, there are comorbidities, or it's sometimes confused, for example, with social anxiety. But the difference with this insecure outside is what stands behind it. So the core is still like, I feel insecure about the world or people judging me, because I think I'm so great and they shouldn't judge me. So you go into a room and you think everyone's looking at you, but not because that's the center of the world. You are the center of the world. So there's still that narcissistic aspect to it. It's just expressed differently.
Okay. So, well, in terms of time, but yeah, well, maybe I leave it here.
Maybe for the reception afterwards. Good. It's a very interesting topic. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Marlies Houben. She is assistant professor at the Department of Medical and Clinical Psychology at Tilburg University, and she is also a member of the assessment committee.
Yeah, thank you. Dear candidate, dear Vanessa, actually I first would like to start with congratulating you and also the supervisory team with a very nice thesis. I've read the thesis with great interest. I think it really nicely combines a nice collection of studies that all center around a relatively understudied disorder by also adopting different perspectives. The diverse approach is also illustrated by the use of different methodologies. You have lab studies, you have the ESM studies. We also use different statistical tools, so it's all very nice. The quality is also illustrated by the fact that many chapters are also published in peer-reviewed journals, so that's also very nice. And also the open science approach is also highly applaudable, so congratulations. So, of course, you might know I'm an ESM researcher. I'm also mainly interested in changes in emotional states in daily life and the relation with psychopathology. So I was mainly intrigued by chapter 5 and 6 in your dissertation, so I would like to ask some questions about those chapters. The first chapter might feel a bit like a methodological question, but that's not entirely the case, I think. So in chapter 5, you describe an ESM study where you investigate changes and fluctuations in narcissistic states. And you actually do that by using an ESM protocol in which you beep participants 10 times a day for 6 days, right? So basically this ESM protocol would result in assessments with like an average time interval of 1 hour in between assessments. I wonder what the rationale was for this specific ESM protocol, because you also refer to previous studies that also looked at narcissistic states. And they really looked at that on like a day level or a week level. And of course, you're looking at states on a smaller time scale. So I was wondering, was there maybe like a theoretical idea on which you would base the time scale on which you expect the narcissistic states to change? Or was it more like an exploratory approach where you just said like, okay, we will just use like a standard ESM protocol that is typically used? So I would be happy to hear your ideas about this.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the compliments and for the question. So indeed, there aren't many studies on narcissism in daily life. And so it was to some extent exploratory. And because there wasn't much on narcissism, we looked at other studies in the EMA domain and looked at what was comparable. We also talked to some EMA researchers who had a lot more experience than us. And so for us, the idea was that it should be frequent enough. So we didn't just want 5 times a day or something. So 10 seemed like it was still doable for participants, but still gave us a lot of data. So then we were also like concerned with people going to bed at some point and so on. So we decided to have those 10 across like a 12-hour time span, so that hopefully everyone is awake at the beginning and at the end of it. And so they were then roughly 75 minutes apart, though that was slightly randomized within that time frame. So yeah, there wasn't a perfect rationale behind it. It just needed to be frequent enough, and we went with what was acceptable in the area.
Okay, that's reasonable, yeah. Imagine if you would want to do like a follow-up ESM study, further exploring these narcissistic states. Would you then continue with like the same time scale, or would you maybe consider like, okay, maybe we should have a look and try different time scales and then maybe see on which time scale the strongest fluctuations occur? Is that something you would consider, or do you think like, no, I think probably it changes from hour to hour and we just should stick to that?
No, I would love to do that actually.
Yeah.
One step at a time though, but
Yeah.
if I had to choose, I would probably go with a shorter time scale even.
Okay.
Because we're not sure if that picked up all the fluctuations, and also, I know that's not the chapter you were talking about, but also the switches. We're not sure, when they exactly occur. So it'd be nice to have even more assessments throughout the day. But I would love to compare different timescales, because we just don't know narcissism yet. And so that's just something that has to be slowly established. So more frequent and less frequent, I think, would both be great to explore.
Yeah, seems like a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Then I had like additional question also about chapter 5. So one of the main findings was that the global narcissistic traits were associated with higher levels of variability and instability of the respective narcissistic states. And but of course, this is very descriptive. So we know that people high in narcissistic traits, that they show larger fluctuations. But then we also know from theory that states don't randomly fluctuate. Often there's like an underlying process, something that is driving the changes. And of course, you already hint at some possible mechanisms throughout the thesis, but I wonder, maybe I would like to invite you to speculate a little bit. What would be specific mechanisms or triggers or factors that could really contribute to fluctuations in, for example, the grandiose state specifically, but also in the vulnerable state specifically?
Yeah, of course. Well, there are quite a few things that could influence it. I think the possibilities are pretty endless. Yeah. With narcissism, one is an ego threat, so anything that could attack this fragile core that they tend to have, where they then feel the need to, go against it with those unpleasant characteristics that we know. So not feeling competent, not feeling acknowledged or seen. So with grandiose, I think it's probably more about not being able to show like their power over people. And similar things with the vulnerable, I think it's more being neglected, more being underappreciated, so a bit more silent in that sense. And that's actually our aim, to explore these triggers. That's something we measured in the EMA as well. A lot of related concepts, so the fragile ego, obviously positive and negative affect, activity, company, events, the big things. This was like our first step. And our next step would be to then see what relates to these fluctuations. And we already picked variables that we think have a high chance of relating to it, based on at least traits and literature. So yeah, my guess would be mostly anything that threatens the ego. Yeah,
Okay, very clear, nice. Would you then expect that it's mainly the occurrence of the triggers? Or would it also be maybe the lack of coping strategies, emotional regulation options to deal with the reaction? Because of course...
Could you give a short answer, please?
Yes. I think both. I think narcissists do like a lot of emotion regulation, and I do think that there's a lot of over and under regulation in a lot of times. So I do think that both plays a role. That's a very short answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions and the answers. Then the opposition will be continued by Professor Henry Otgaar. He is Professor of Legal Psychology at the Faculty of Psychology and Neuroscience at our university, and he was also a member of the Assessment Committee.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, I agree with my colleagues. You have an outstanding thesis. My compliments to you, certainly also your supervisory team. It's really a wonderful thesis. It's not only wonderful because of the content, but also because of another reason. But that's a personal reason. And that's because of the fifth statement proposition that you have. It's a statement by the great Dalai Lama, in which he stated, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. So if you think about the Dalai Lama, you might think that this is a person who is always right. I think he's wrong here. And so my questions are related to this fifth proposition. And I like the Dalai Lama a lot. So I don't want to criticize him, but I will do now, because my questions are related to the chapters on self-compassion. Mm-hmm. And I have three questions. So in chapters 3 and 4, you were interested in inducing self-compassion and other compassion as well. You were interested how this was related to self-compassion and narcissism. You measured trait and state self-compassion and examined whether these inductions had any effects. So here's my issue. As you might know, there's a big expert in this room on self-compassion. That's my colleague, Professor Mures. I write some papers together with him on it, but I think he's the main expert on it. We have been critical, and not only we, but others, about the measurement of self-compassion, and perhaps the definition as well. The self-compassion scale has often been used as some way, an index for measuring individual differences in self-compassion, which is seen as some sort of protective psychological factor that would maintain people's mental health. On the one hand, the scale's developer, Kristen Neff, she keeps the idea, the position that the compassionate, so self-kindness and mindfulness, etc., but also the uncompassionate responding components should be merged in one total score. That would lead to a reliable and valid index of self-compassion. However, on the other hand, there are scholars who have questioned this procedure and showed with data that if you separate the uncompassionate and compassionate subscales, that you sometimes find different results, and that oftentimes the uncompassionate scales are doing sometimes the most in explaining some of the effects. So scholars have advised, if you use these self-compassion scales, like you have done as well, you should not only report the total score, but also report the subscales. So, because of my colleague, she also said, it's great that you have made your data available, so I can look into the data. Perhaps I can look whether these subscale scores were there. They were not there, they're only the total scores, if I'm correct. But so here's my first question. So you stated and wrote some specific hypothesis, spillover hypothesis, for example. So what would you expect how your results would behave if you would separate the compassionate and uncompassionate subscales, linking it with these spillover hypotheses that you, for example, in chapter 3 and 4 have induced, or have written about? And my second question then, in chapter 4 and also 3, you used self-compassion inductions, which I think is a very good way, not only measuring it, but trying to experimentally induce it. If you look in the appendix on how to induce this self-compassion, you only focus on the compassionate one, right? Increasing some type of mindfulness, boosting kindness. Isn't here the same problem as well? That if you really want to target self-compassion, you should have asked participants also to come up with examples and how they can reduce uncompassionate responding. So this is you only report one side of the coin, or investigate perhaps one side of the coin. So that brings me to the Dalai Lama again, right? Because I think the Dalai Lama is wrong. I mean, he states, if you want to be happy, practice compassion. But should it be, if you want to be happy, practice being less uncompassionate? I'm interested in your thoughts about that.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the compliments, and thank you for the question and the thought process behind it. I am afraid I I'm now stuck at the second question. Can you repeat?
Yes,
please
certainly.
repeat
No,
the first
that's
one?
my fault. I was thinking, should I do it one by one? But then it maybe would reduce the entire story. Anyways, the first question was about, you use a total score, right? Yeah. So, what would happen if you, as suggested, would split this score in compassionate subscale, uncompassionate one? And what effect would that have on your hypotheses? And maybe also your findings?
Yes, so I mean, I can only guess. As you said yourself, only looked at the positive scales for the induction, then I would assume that maybe the compassionate responding items would increase more than the uncompassionate items would decrease, but that's a guess. And the whole project overall, our goal wasn't necessarily to investigate self and other compassion. It was to see if we can work, with a pro-social or a, for yourself, a good thing with narcissists, if that's even possible to induce it. So we didn't focus too much on the compassionate and uncompassionate items. We are aware of the discussion, and we looked at it and we considered it, but there's also, it would have also just been a little bit too much with the analysis. We wouldn't have had the power to look at the subscales at some point anymore. As you see, the papers are already very long with a lot of analyses. I think I'm mixing your two questions a bit now.
That's okay.
But
no problem.
So we also had, so you're right, it wasn't in the supplementary materials, but we had an idea, which we didn't follow through on, but we had an idea to look at narcissistic traits and self and other compassion traits and see how they related, because there's mixed findings and not strongly powered findings in the literature. And while that paper wasn't written due to time constraints, we did look at it in our sample. And we found that when the narcissistic traits were positively related to the total score, that they were also significantly positively related to compassionate responding and significantly negatively related to uncompassionate responding. So it was relatively even.
Mm-hmm.
However, with the induction, I can't say if that would have been the same, like if that would have had an influence on the states. Yeah. But I would assume that hopefully the compassionate respondent items would increase more, given that that is what we targeted. We didn't target, the uncompassionate responding, or as sometimes argued, the pathological side of narcissism.
Yeah, so maybe a short follow-up question, if that's okay, Prorector. So thank you for this elaboration. And maybe wondering about my second question, which is about inducing self-compassion, right? So I understand if you want to induce it, it sounds very logical, intuitive to focus on the compassionate stuff, right? Boosting mindfulness. So this is just more out of curiosity. Do you think that if you would simultaneously add an exercise in which people have to imagine examples on how they would reduce uncompassionate responding, would that lead to similar effect? Would that also boost self-compassion? Or would you think, well, actually, that would be a really weird exercise, thinking about uncompassionate stuff and then trying to reduce it mentally, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, I can only take a guess, but I think it's first of all hard to reduce uncompassionate responding. You usually induce something that's more doing something and not doing something. Mm-hmm. And in general, the uncompassionate responding is, I also don't think the two of them, like compassionate and uncompassionate responding, necessarily exclude themselves. Like you can be not uncompassionate, but that doesn't necessarily mean you are compassionate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I understand.
Yeah, so I think it could have some effect, but I don't think it would have necessarily the same effect as increasing or inducing compassionate responding, but but that's only an assumption.
Okay. Thank you for your answers. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm immediately thinking about an intervention for your colleague in the situation you sketched. Okay, that was off the record. So the opposition will be continued by Professor Johan Vlaeyen. He is a professor of psychology of bodily distress disorders at the Department of Clinical Psychological Science, Faculty of Psychology and Neuroscience here at Maastricht University.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, I also would like to congratulate you with the work. It's a big thesis, there's a lot of work apparently. But also the content is quite interesting. It's not my area, so I was very curious to read about it, and I learned quite a bit of things about narcissism. And I also would like to congratulate you with your proposition number 7, which is about the difference between the cross-sectional assessments versus the more state-related, complex, idiographic and dynamic process-related research. I think we need more of that because the cross-sectional, often we look at averages, and the question is about how can you generalize those averages to individuals. So you're making that step. And I will have a question about that. But before I do that, I have a more general question that is related to narcissism. That is how, in what extent do you trust your data? And could there be any bias in your data just because you're studying these people? You mentioned something like characteristic like manipulative, self-protecting behavior. Could that also generalize to the way they responded to your questions in these studies? Mm-hmm. And if so, is there a way to control for that?
Yeah. Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the compliments and thank you for the question. So in general, do I trust him? More or less. I think the same amount as I trust other participants. People can always not pay attention or can try to appear, socially desirable or be manipulative. I don't think that's a purely narcissistic thing. Also, we have to consider that it is a subclinical sample. I do think, looking at the traits, there might be some people who would possibly meet some criteria, but I don't think that's necessarily more or less than other people have in their research, because we didn't specifically look for narcissists. And there have been studies about it, and whether narcissists might, try to manipulate especially pro-social interventions or questionnaires, and they found, they tested it in multiple ways. I can't recall all of them now, but they found that that wasn't the case, and that generally they can be trusted with these questionnaires. And I think that's also a lot of times one of the narcissistic characteristics, to not necessarily be ashamed of how you're acting. You think you're great, so the way you're acting is nothing you necessarily need to hide. Okay. So if anything, it could even be possibly the opposite, but that's just a guess.
Okay. That's good news, actually. So that means that you trust the data, and that we can also trust the data. That's fine. I go to my second question about the your second part, which is very interesting, because there you go into the dynamics, daily life, and using EMA and looking at variability and so on. But I noticed some kind of an inconsistency, because you seem to move towards the more idiographic. I'm thinking about chapter 7, where you have these cases, where you have this nice description of these cases. So that's very in line with an idiographic approach, looking at the individual, person-centered. But it seems to me that you could go a step further, because the measures that you are using in that study are nomothetically inspired. They come from existing questionnaires that have been designed to study groups, not individuals. So imagine you would go a step further, and you would also apply the idiographic attitude in this study and include idiographic measures rather than the measures from questionnaires. Is that feasible, and how would you do that?
I do think that's feasible.
And would you agree, first of all?
Yes, I would. Generally, that's a line of research that I am relatively passionate about, or in the process discovered my passion around it. So I'd love to continue it, given the chance and time. So I also was new to EMA and was new to, I mean, for us it was case descriptions. It wasn't proper N01 or SCED research. But that was actually the paper that I found the easiest to write, so I would love to continue in that direction. And I do think it is possible. How I would do it, I think that's something left for future me to figure out, but my initial idea would be to establish a strong baseline from which possibly first with the questions that we have, but then to adapt them to the individual or to the individual situations. I'm not sure of the procedure there. I haven't done these studies yet. But I would also, apart from individualizing the questions, I would love to individualize maybe interventions. So I know in SCED research, like having phase designs with like baseline intervention, to see what influences these switches and fluctuations, and maybe on a more personal level. So no, I think it would be feasible. I would definitely have to do a lot more reading to figure out how exactly. But yes, that would definitely be one of the studies that I'd love to do if I get the chance to do individualized assessments from one person and possibly add some experimental variables.
Wow, that links very nice. That sounds very nice. And if you do, I would really encourage you to pursue this path. This is, I think, needed. If I have some time, last question? No?
Maybe.
I'm sorry. I give the word back to the program.
Yes. But thank you for the questions and the answers. So the opposition will be continued by Dr. Kai Karos. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Clinical and Psychological Science of Maastricht University's Faculty of Psychology and Neuroscience. And yeah, that's it. The floor is yours.
Nothing to be said. Thank you. One last time, congratulations on a really nice thesis, also to you and to your supervisory team, like a really nice in-depth look in a rather complex, much-needed construct. You used a lot of different methodologies. I really thought that was one of the big strengths of the thesis. Open science throughout, during Corona, large samples. I think it was a very impressive piece of work that you delivered. Because Johan couldn't ask his questions, I'm going to try to continue asking in his spirit. My first one was out of personal interest because you mainly use student samples. Presumably most of them were FPN students. I'm curious, how do our students compare in narcissism levels to other universities or maybe general population? Is this representative to general population? Because of course that's what you're trying to show, right?
Yeah.
Or do we have maybe elevated levels of narcissism at our faculty?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the compliments and the question. So I'm afraid we're pretty average.
Okay. Well, maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah, probably. So compared to other samples in that general age range and a mix of females and males, it seems very comparable to other study types.
Also outside of universities?
Outside of universities as well, yes. And there was a lot of students, they weren't all students, so it's also general community sample.
Okay, that's good to know. The second question I have is on chapter 4, the compassion intervention in chapter 3. In your abstract of chapter 4, you write that you show basically with the intervention that you could increase other compassionate behavior. And then you did me the favor of writing behavior, because you would probably agree that you did not actually measure behavior. You measured, like others said, questionnaires, and that might be prone to bias. But I thought maybe, have you considered how you could actually measure compassionate behavior in the lab? Which would probably get you into the direction of pro-social behavior, for instance?
Yeah, you caught me there. No, we didn't measure the behavior unless you consider writing about it, the behavior. I have not thought about it, to be honest. I am not necessarily a self-compassion researcher in that sense. We did spend a lot of time on it. It was more purely on the basis of whether we can do something with it in narcissists. But
how about other compassion? Because clinically, I would think that's also very important, right? You try to make, especially with personalities, you try to make them more pro-social towards others. Could you think of a measure there to measure behavior in the lab?
I could imagine that you could create scenarios with actors, for example, where someone needs help, and you see if a person walks past or if they stop to help after completing other compassion measure versus completing a measure on humor, I don't know, or some other,
Yeah, I think that would be a really nice study, especially related to your chapter 2, where you show that they're quite aware that they sometimes use others or disregard others to get ahead. So if you would create a situation where maybe the narcissist needs to get ahead or needs to help, if that kind of decision would change based on, for instance, compassion. And maybe to end on a bigger picture question, you state also in your presentation that you really like the state idea of narcissism, and you also stress that then the situation becomes really important, the context, maybe experiences that someone have, and you're probably aware that there's a lot of research and also in the media that we live in times of social media, and that a lot of people claim that we become more narcissistic because of social media. How do you think about that in relation to your more dynamic idea of narcissism? Is that then something that would support this idea, that maybe environmental variables can make us more narcissistic? And if you say yes, then how? What is it about social media that is to blame?
I don't necessarily think that the situations can make us more narcissistic as a trait, but I do think that they can trigger potential states. So, for example, social media, if you scroll on Instagram and you see what all these people are doing, they also mostly just show the positive, great parts of their life. So they're great, and you're sitting at home on a sofa and you're doing nothing. That can hurt your ego. You feel like you don't have, the same amazing life, or they have a better looking, house, or they have a better car, and you constantly see it and you're exposed to it. So I do think that it can trigger the states to some extent, but I do think the traits already need to be there to some extent for the states to be triggered by these situations or by social media.
So you think the trait is a prerequisite for the state to be triggered? So let's say social media might be maladaptive for some, but only if they already have narcissistic traits, for instance.
I think social media can be maladaptive in a lot of ways, but maybe not necessarily in narcissistic ways. And I also think that people who aren't narcissistic can experience narcissistic emotions. I just would assume that they aren't triggered as heavily and as frequently, and that the intensity would be lesser.
Vanessa Lea Freund, the time reserved for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company will await the results here and our return in this room.
Thank you.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. The line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Get the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
And when they give you the diploma, I have to go there, so you need to make. Was müssen wir nochmal damit? What do you?
Yeah,
we will put it
you don't
here,
have to do
but
anything.
then I need to be standing there.
When she does the oath.
Yeah, when they.
I guess resistant. It doesn't matter.
Vanessa Lea Freund. The degree committee present here has assessed the quality of your thesis and the way you defended it. In view of its positive evaluation and taking into account your previous educational qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Dr. Jill Lobbestyle is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I invite both your supervisors to now take the floor. Please stand.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authorization vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Vanessa Lea Freund, the degree of doctor and grant you all the rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I will now present you with a degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
And I invite Dr. Lobbestyle to hold the laudatio.
Okay, dear Vanessa, it is a great honor to stand in front of you at this very special moment, the moment where you just earned your title as Dr. Vanessa Freund. And with this, you make Frank and me very proud supervisors. And I will take the next minutes to explain to you and the audience why we are so proud today, while completely ignoring the fact that this will make you feel highly uncomfortable. The two of us have quite some history together already. We met while you were doing your research master and I was looking for a research assistant. You immediately struck me as a hardworking and clever student that I could rely on, and I was right about that. You also did your master thesis under my supervision, and you were simply one of the best students that I ever had. I can still very clearly envision the moment where we said goodbye after the last thesis meeting. And I watched you walking down the hallway, and that was one of those aha moments in life, as I realized I cannot let this one go yet. At that moment, I did not have a full position, a PhD position available for you, but you then already worked with on two papers with me, so I talked to Frank and invited him to join as a supervisor and build on your scientific work in a fast track to a PhD. Your master thesis, the first bigger project we did together, started with a simple question. What do narcissists think about themselves? Do all of them think they are great and perfect in all areas at all times and better than others? And later on, this simple question led to quite a complex study, though, as we thought that the answer would depend on a lot of things, like the type of narcissism they would display, the subcomponents, daily fluctuations. And in the end, we somehow found ourselves tangled up in complex discussions on things like parsimonious mismatches. And for anyone except Vanessa present here, never mind. I did notice that turning basic questions into complicated designs became a pattern with us as a team. And we had many discussions on how complicated narcissism, and by extension life, can be. And in these discussions, Frank and I would often plead for keeping things simple or clean. And your typical reply to this would be, but I think it also depends on this or that. We should also take into account this or that. We also debated a lot about writing style. And oftentimes we would be trying to move you towards simplifying your beautifully constructed sentences. And this killing of your babies was oftentimes really painful to you. But something else now. The sharp observers among us probably noticed the turtles in Vanessa's presentation, and this is also how we called ourselves as a team, the turtle team. And we take pride in being turtles. And many of the traits of this magnificent animal are reflected in you, Vanessa. You are wise and intelligent, self-aware, not afraid to take your time and to decide for your own path, and you're very loyal to your friends and family. And as a true turtle, you love to travel, but will always want to return as soon as possible to your beloved Hamburg. And you're also very persistent. When you put your mind to something, you will achieve it, no matter how much effort it takes. You are also stubborn, as turtles tend to be. And some things simply do not seem to permeate your shell, like our many, many pleads of how much fun presenting can be, or the many compliments we try to give you. But now that you're standing here and cannot escape, let me repeat those compliments to you. Vanessa, you are a kind and warm person with an incredibly sharp mind. You are hardworking, always on top of things, knowledgeable about every detail of your project, as well as the literature. We hope that you are observing this now, because if there is something we would wish for you, then it would be for you to believe more in yourself and to stick with the topic of your PhD thesis, a bit more narcissistic. One more important fact, you are not just a turtle, you are a fast turtle. You finished your PhD at about 3 years only, which is simply incredible. And I hope that you never forget what you accomplished with this. So Vanessa, I want to end this laudatio with wishing you all the best for the future. And for now, you decided to become a licensed psychotherapist, which you will no doubt achieve. And I hope you will also bring scientific work back into your life after this or during this. We hope you will celebrate your newly obtained title with your family and friends, with your mother and sister, and we are also sure that your father is with you in spirit here today. Again, we are super proud promoters today, and we will continue to be your fans. Congratulations.
Dear Dr. Freund, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree you have just obtained. I also want to extend my heartfelt congratulations to your supervisory team, your family, your friends, colleagues, and anybody else who played a role, and as many people I saw in your acknowledgement that helped you, supported you, etc. This closes this academic session officially. We are now ready to celebrate. You are all invited to